Okay, so two-dimensional arrays is where we start to get a little bit more complicated, but it is something that is almost guaranteed to come up somewhere in your exam, and quite often one-dimensional and two-dimensional arrays are used in parallel. And what that means is that the index of the row of our 2D array is going to be the same as the index of an item in our one-dimensional array. So using things in parallel is going to be something which is probably going to come up in the exam. I think that's definitely something to revise. And again, one of the other things to remember is that Python allows us to do a few things that most programming languages don't. So there is a limitation of storing data in arrays that you will have as an expectation. So they will expect you to state this even though Python allows you not to. So one of the statements that they make about arrays, and this is programming theory as a whole, is that an array can only hold one type of data. So one data type, you can have an array of strings, an array of integers, an array of floats, an array of booleans, but you can't have, in fact, you can have an array of arrays, which is what a 2D array is, but you can't have different data types in that array. So if you have a one-dimensional array of strings, it is a list of strings. If you have a two-dimensional array of strings, you have an array of strings inside an array with more arrays of strings. So only one data type. Python technically will allow you to put in all sorts of data types and it will be absolutely fine because it's actually a matrix. But when you do your exam, please don't mix up your data types. So a nested loop, fantastic. A nested loop is a loop inside of a loop. Absolutely perfect. So nested loops, if we are using them with 2D arrays, they are used to access, first of all, each row of the array. So in this case, we would get Alice, Bob, Charlie, those inner arrays. So you can see there's two sets of square brackets being used. And then the inner loop is then used to access each item in the array. In this case, we don't need to use a nested loop. We don't need a for loop inside a for loop because what we're doing is we're accessing each row and then using the data using an index, so using a numbered index. So if we want to access their name, we would use, in this case, users row in the first set of brackets and then 0 in the second set of brackets. In this case, because we want to know whether their classes are in the morning or in the afternoon, we're using row to get each row and then 1 to access the second piece of data. So yes, absolutely, you can talk about these being rows and columns, or you can talk about them being rows and items. As a rule, if I am writing Python and I know that I'm working with a 2D array, my outer loop, I will use the word row for my count controller instead of I, and then an inner loop, I would use column or item to get each one. Alternatively, you can use I and J, but it can then get a little bit confusing, especially if you're in an exam where you're feeling a bit stressed. It's useful to use those meaningful identifiers. Then you can picture things as you're coding. Okay, fantastic. So if you're using a 2D array, you're going to use 2 indexes. There is such a thing as a 3D multi-dimensional arrays, but we don't touch on those at all. We use 1 and 2D arrays, and we tend to use them in parallel. So we have multiple indexes. So in our one-dimensional array, our index pointed to the position of an item in a list. And that's no difference no different to an index in a 2D array. It's pointing to something in an array. If we look at the way that Python presents a 2D array, it is an array of arrays. So actually, they tend to be a little bit easier to understand. So one of those indexes is used as a row, so we can point to each row. And then the second is a pointer to the items within the inner array. So in this case, we've got 4 rows. And within those rows, we have 2 columns. So we have Alice, Bob, Charlie, and Diana in our first column, so column 0. And then in column 1, it's the AM or PM for when their classes are. So if we were then to use users 2, 0, that would be Charlie. Now, technically in Python, we wouldn't display it as a comma. We would have each of those in their own set of square brackets. So on here, we would actually have users 2, close the square brackets, open them again, and then a 0 in the second one. And absolutely. So a visualization is the way that we describe the way that humans look at data versus the way that computers look at data. Computers will look at it mathematically. They will see this as a matrix, an array of arrays. Humans tend to look at things visually. And so a one-dimensional array will be a list, and a 2-dimensional array absolutely is a table. And because a table has rows and columns, we're able to imagine our data actually positioned as a table. This doesn't change between GCSE and an A level. It's still a table, still used in the same way.